Hey guys, Alias here. This is going to be another episode of Serial Stories. I was going to do a live recording for this one, but my room is a mess because I lost my keys and I tore my room apart and I don't have a lot of time to record. So we're just going to do it like this. Hope you guys like it. Sarah Hayes had always been proud of her independence. At 32, she was living the life she had dreamed of in her 20s. A small but cozy apartment in Portland, a thriving freelance graphic design career, and a sense of freedom that her suburban childhood had never promised. Her days were filled with projects for small businesses, local art collectives, and the occasional passion piece that she had uploaded to her personal website. Sarah had always believed that hard work would solve everything, and in a way, it had. Until the day that it didn't. She had always been thin, but over the past year she had grown gaunt. It wasn't something that she noticed immediately. A skipped breakfast here, a forgotten lunch there. It was all part of the hustle. What mattered was delivering on deadlines and building her portfolio. When hunger struck, Sarah reached for whatever was closest. Instant noodles, a protein bar, maybe some chips or cookies left from the other night. Her kitchen, which had once been a source of pride, now served as little more than a backdrop for hastily microwaved meals. The signs were subtle at first. Sarah often joked about being tired, blaming it on long hours she had spent at her desk. Burnout is part of the job, she would tell herself, sipping yet another cup of black coffee. When she started noticing bruises on her arms and legs, she chalked it up to her own clumsiness. It wasn't unusual for her to bump into a table or to scrape her shin on the edge of her bed. But these bruises felt different. They were larger, darker, and slower to fade. Her gums began to bleed one morning as she brushed her teeth. She spat into the sink, watching the crimson streak swirl down the drain. "Maybe I'm brushing too hard," she muttered, though the metallic taste lingered long after she had rinsed. Over the weeks, she found herself avoiding crunchy foods, favoring soft bread and noodles. Smiling for photos became a self-conscious act as her gums swelled and her teeth felt loose, though she convinced herself that it was just in her head. By the time summer had arrived, Sarah was struggling to keep up with her workload. Her joints ached constantly, and her hands felt stiff and weak, making it difficult for her to hold her stylus. Even walking to the corner store became an ordeal. Her legs felt heavy, as though she were trudging through mud. Despite her worsening symptoms, she refused to slow down. "I can't afford to take a break," she thought. "Everything will fall apart if I stop now." One evening, while video chatting with her friend, Lauren, Sarah leaned back in her chair, accidentally exposing her forearms to the camera. Lauren frowned. "Sarah, what's going on with your skin?" she asked, her tone sharp with concern. Sarah glanced down. The pale skin of her arms was mottled with bruises that looked like tiny reddish-purple spots. "Oh, these?" Sarah laughed nervously. "I guess I've been bumping into things a lot lately. No big deal." But Sarah wasn't convinced. "You need to see a doctor," she insisted. Sarah dismissed her concerns, brushing it off as an overreaction. What could a doctor tell her that she didn't already know? She was tired, overworked, and probably just needed a better night's sleep. Then one morning, Sarah woke to find the pillow stained with blood. Panicking, she ran to the bathroom and examined herself in the mirror. Her gums, now a deep red, were visibly receding, and the teeth near the front of her mouth seemed to wiggle slightly as she pressed her tongue against them. Her heart raced as she tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of weird infection? She resolved to make an appointment with the dentist, but kept brushing it off, as her schedule grew increasingly packed with client deadlines. The collapse came 2 weeks later. Sarah had been working late into the night on a particularly demanding project. Her fingers cramped as she forced herself to finish the final details, ignoring the throbbing pain in her wrists. When she finally stood to stretch, a wave of dizziness hit her like a freight train. Her vision blurred, and before she could reach the counter to steady herself, she crumpled to the floor. Her neighbor found her hours later, unconscious and feverish. At the hospital, doctors ran a battery of tests, baffled by the combination of symptoms she presented. Her skin was pale and blotched with petrichai, small red or purple spots caused by bleeding underneath the skin. Her gums were swollen and bleeding, and several teeth were on the verge of falling out. Old scars on her body had inexplicably reopened, oozing blood as though she had been recently inflicted. Sarah woke to a team of doctors standing over her, their expressions a mix of concerns and disbelief. "Miss Hayes," one of them began gently, "we need to talk about your diet." Confused and embarrassed, Sarah explained her eating habits, or lack thereof. She admitted that most of her meals came from instant noodles, frozen dinners, and snack foods. She couldn't remember the last time that she'd eaten fresh fruit or vegetables. The nutritionist on staff pieced the puzzle together quickly. "Sarah," she said, her voice firm but compassionate, "your body's been deprived of vitamin C for a very long time. What you're experiencing is called scurvy." The word hung in the air like a relic from a bygone era. Scurvy. The disease sailors got in the 1700s seemed impossible, almost laughable. But as the nutritionist explained, scurvy was not a thing of the past. It was rare in developed countries, but not unheard of, especially among individuals with restricted diets or limited access to fresh produce. The treatment was simple: vitamin C supplements and a drastic change in diet. But the road to recovery was anything but easy. Sarah's body, weakened by months of neglect, took weeks to show signs of improvement. The psychological toll was even greater. She grappled with feelings of guilt and shame, wondering how she let herself spiral so far. Months later, Sarah sat at her favorite coffee shop, a bowl of fresh fruit beside her laptop. Her gums had healed, her teeth were secure, and the bruises had faded from her skin. But the experience left a lasting scar on her body, but not on her sense of invincibility. "It's so easy to take your health for granted," she reflected. "I thought I was untouchable, but I wasn't." Megan Reeves loved the outdoors. At 27, she was an avid hiker, camper, and animal lover. Her Instagram was filled with snapshots of her adventures, sunlit trails winding through the towering pines, misty mountain peaks, and, more often than not, pictures of wildlife that she had encountered. Her friends admired her adventurous spirit, jokingly calling her Snow White for the way the animals seemed to gravitate toward her. It was during one of these excursions into the wilderness that Megan's life changed forever. She had been camping alone near the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, savoring the solitude and the crisp autumn air. While walking back to her tent at dusk, she noticed movement near a tree line. A raccoon was stumbling in the underbrush, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. Megan assumed it was injured and approached cautiously. The animal turned to face her, and for a moment she hesitated. Its eyes were glassy, its fur matted with mud and something dark that she couldn't quite identify. Before she could react, the raccoon lunged, biting into the sleeve of her flannel shirt and sinking its teeth into her forearm. Megan screamed, shaking the animal off, and it darted back into the woods, leaving her stunned and bleeding. She wrapped her arm in a bandana and cleaned the wound with water from the canteen. "It's just a scratch," she thought, brushing off the fear that gnawed at the edges of her mind. After all, she had camped dozens of times before without issue. Why would this be any different? Over the next few days, Megan convinced herself that she didn't need medical attention. The bite had scabbed over, and aside from some redness, her arm felt fine. She chalked up the lingering soreness to her active lifestyle and tried to move on. But 2 weeks later, she began to feel different. Started with a headache, sharp, persistent, and unlike anything she had experienced before. Megan attributed it to stress, blaming her long hours as a veterinary assistant and the constant pressure of balancing work and hobbies. But the headache didn't go away. It worsened, spreading down her neck and shoulders, until even turning her head felt like a monumental effort. And then came the fever. By the third day, Megan was sweating through her clothes, shivering despite the warmth in her apartment. She stayed home from work, thinking that she'd caught the flu. Her appetite vanished, replaced by an unshakable nausea that left her weak and lightheaded. She tried to stay hydrated, but even sipping water felt wrong. It didn't quench her thirst. Instead, it made her gag. Megan's friends noticed her withdrawal. Normally quick to respond to texts and calls, she became uncharacteristically quiet. When her best friend Danielle stopped by unannounced, Megan barely opened the door. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and she seemed off. "I'm just really tired," she muttered, avoiding eye contact. But Danielle couldn't ignore the way Megan flinched when she reached out to touch her arm. "You're burning up," Danielle said. But Megan shrugged her off, insisting she'd be fine after some rest. By the end of the week, Megan's symptoms had escalated dramatically. She was plagued by vivid nightmares, waking up drenched in sweat with a pounding heart. Her throat felt tight, as though something was lodged deep inside, and swallowing became an agonizing task. Water, once a source of relief, now filled her with an inexplicable dread. The sight of it made her recoil, her stomach twisting in knots. The breaking point came one evening when Megan heard the sound of dogs barking outside of her window. The noise, which would have been barely noticeable under normal circumstances, sent her into a panic. She covered her ears, rocking back and forth on the couch, muttering incoherently. Her mind felt like it was splitting apart. Her thoughts fractured and jumbled. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and the walls of her apartment felt as though they were closing in. Danielle, alarmed at Megan's behavior, called 911. By the time paramedics arrived, Megan was totally incoherent. She lashed out at them, screaming and thrashing as they tried to calm her down. At the hospital, doctors sedated her and began running tests. Her symptoms were puzzling: neurological agitation, hypersensitivity, and a deep fear of water that the nurses couldn't explain. It wasn't until a doctor noticed the faint scar on Megan's forearm that the pieces began to fall into place. When asked about the marks, Megan, delirious and barely able to speak, mumbled something about a raccoon. That detail was enough to trigger alarm bells. The medical team immediately suspected rabies. The next 48 hours were a blur of desperate interventions. Rabies is almost always fatal when symptoms appear, and Megan's condition was rapidly deteriorating. Her fever spiked to dangerous levels, and she began to experience uncontrollable muscle spasms. She became increasingly paranoid, screaming about animals that weren't there and clawing at her own skin. The doctors tried an experimental treatment, inducing a coma in an attempt to give her body time to fight the virus, but it was too late. Megan passed away 3 days later. In the aftermath, her friends and family were left grappling with the shocking reality of her death. Rabies was something they'd only ever heard of about in passing, a distant threat. They never imagined that it could claim someone so young and vibrant and full of life. The bite that had seemed so inconsequential at the time was, in fact, a death sentence. And while rabies is rare, Megan's story serves as a sobering reminder. Some risks, no matter how small, should never be ignored. Now, Megan should have known as a vet tech that if she got bit by a wild animal, she should probably get checked for rabies. I think she lied on her resume. For Ellie Walker, summers meant one thing: time spent at her grandma's house in the countryside. At 15, Ellie loved the freedom of running barefoot through the fields, exploring the woods, and helping her grandma tend to the small garden behind the house. She wasn't afraid of getting her hands dirty, something her parents always joked about when she returned home with muddy clothes and scraped knees. One summer afternoon, Ellie was out in the garden pulling weeds when she spotted a jagged chunk of pottery buried in the dirt. It looked old, and maybe valuable, and her curiosity got the better of her. She tried to pry it loose with her fingers, but it wouldn't budge. Determined, she grabbed a trowel and dug around it. When she finally freed the shard, she didn't notice the sharp edge until it sliced into her palm. "Ah, crap," Ellie muttered, dropping the pottery. Blood welled up from the cut, and she hurried back to the house. Her grandma cleaned the wound with soap and water and then wrapped it in gauze. "You'll be fine," her grandmother reassured her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Ellie, eager to get back outside, didn't give it another thought. The days passed, and Ellie continued her adventures, barely noticing the dull ache in her hand. But by the end of the week, the ache had turned into a throb. The skin around the cut had become swollen and hot, a faint streak of red running up her wrist. Ellie's grandmother, concerned, urged her to rest and keep the wound clean. They assumed it was a mild infection and nothing serious. But the spasms began. It started with her jaw. Ellie woke up one morning unable to open her mouth fully, her muscles tight and uncooperative. She thought maybe that she had been clenching her teeth in her sleep, but the stiffness didn't go away. By the afternoon, her neck felt rigid and swallowing became difficult. She didn't tell her grandmother at first, embarrassed by the idea of making her fuss over what seemed to be a simple cut. But that night as she lay in bed, her body betrayed her. A sudden, violent spasm shot through her back, causing her to cry out in pain. Her grandmother rushed in to find Ellie arched unnaturally, her muscles locked in painful rigidity. "I can't move," Ellie gasped, tears streaming down her face. Her grandmother tried to soothe her, but the spasms came in waves, each one worse than the last. They rushed her to the nearest hospital, nearly 40 minutes away. By the time they arrived, Ellie could barely speak. Her jaw was clenched shut, her body trembling uncontrollably. Doctors immediately recognized the symptoms: muscle rigidity, spasms, difficulty swallowing. When they asked about recent injuries, Ellie's mother mentioned the cut on her hand. "That's it," one of the doctors said grimly. "Tetanus." Ellie's condition worsened rapidly. The bacteria that had caused the disease, Clostridium tetani, had entered her body through the wound. It thrived in the oxygen-free environment of her infected tissue, releasing a toxin that attacked her nervous system. The spasms spread throughout her body, turning her muscles into an iron band that refused to relax. Even the smallest stimulation, light, noise, touch, could trigger full-body spasms that left her gasping for air. The medical team moved quickly, administering antitoxins to neutralize the poison and sedatives to ease the relentless muscle contractions. Ellie was placed in a dark, quiet room to minimize triggers, but the damage was already done. Her muscles remained locked, her breathing shallow and labored. Every movement was a battle against the unrelenting grip of her own body. For weeks, Ellie fought to recover. Doctors explained that, even with treatment, tetanus could leave lasting effects. Her body would need time to repair the damage caused by the toxin. She endured grueling physical therapy to regain control of her movements, and the memory of those spasms haunted her for long after the pain had subsided. When Ellie finally returned home, she was quieter and more cautious. The carefree girl who had once raced through the fields barefoot now wore gloves when gardening, and kept a close eye on every scrape and cut. Her parents made sure that she stayed up to date on her vaccinations, something that they admitted they hadn't given much thought to before. Tetanus, Ellie would later reflect, isn't something you think about until it's too late. I didn't know what it was until I had it, but I'll never forget what it felt like, the way my body had just turned against me. It's something I wouldn't wish on anyone. Roger Decker was a quiet man, a retired machinist living alone in a small town in northern Minnesota. At 68, his life revolved around simple routines: mornings spent fishing on the lake, afternoons tinkering in his shed, and evenings with a book by the fire. His hands, calloused and scarred from decades of hard labor, still found comfort in working with tools. It was during one of those afternoons in the shed that it happened. Roger had been repairing an old motor, the kind of project that kept his mind sharp and his hands busy. As he reached for a wrench, his foot slipped and his shin scraped against the jagged edge of a metal workbench. He hissed in pain and glanced down. The cut wasn't deep, just a shallow gash that bled more than it hurt. "Damn clumsy old fool," he muttered to himself, grabbing a rag to clean the wound. He washed it with soap and water, slapped a bandage on, and went back to work. Barely crossed his mind again. Over the next few days, Roger noticed the cut wasn't healing the way it should. The skin around it turned red and puffy, and it felt warmer to the touch than the rest of his leg. He shrugged it off, figuring he'd been on his feet too much, but soon the redness spread. The wound began to ooze a foul-smelling fluid, and Roger felt the deep ache in his leg that made it hard to sleep. When the pain became unbearable, he finally made the long drive to the nearest urgent care clinic. By then, the swelling had reached his knee, and the skin around the wound was turned a sickly greenish black. The doctor took one look at his leg and ordered him to be hospitalized immediately. Roger was admitted that night, his leg throbbing as the medical team worked to stabilize him. Blood tests confirmed what doctors had feared: gangrene. The injury had become infected and the bacteria had cut off blood flow to the surrounding tissue. Without oxygen, the cells in his leg were dying rapidly, releasing toxins that threatened to poison his entire body. The doctor explained the severity of the situation. "We need to act quickly," she said. "If we don't remove the dead tissue, the infection will spread to your bloodstream and it could kill you." Roger's heart sank. He'd heard about gangrene before, but it had always seemed like something out of a history book and not something that could happen to him. The thought of losing part of his leg was almost too much to bear, but the alternative, a slow and painful death, was even worse. The surgery was grueling. The doctors amputated his lower leg, removing not just the infected tissue but a margin of healthy flesh to ensure that the bacteria didn't spread. When Roger woke up, he was groggy and disoriented, the absence of his leg hitting him like a punch to the gut. The recovery process was long and arduous. Roger had always been a solitary man, but the loss of his independence was crushing. Simple tasks like getting out of bed or using the bathroom now required assistance. Physical therapy sessions were grueling, pushing his body to adapt to the prosthetic leg that he would eventually receive. What haunted Roger the most wasn't the pain or the loss of his limb. It was the smell. The acrid, rotten stench that clung to him in the hospital stayed with him in his nightmares, a visceral reminder of how close he had come to death. Months later, Roger sat on the porch of his cabin, staring out at the lake. His fishing pole leaned against the railing, unused. He hadn't mustered the strength to go back out on the water yet. His leg was gone, and with it, a piece of the life that he had built for himself. But he was still here, breathing the crisp Minnesota air, watching the sun set over the pines. Gangrene was a silent predator, lurking beneath the surface. It had almost taken everything from him. Almost. Marie Langston was once the life of every room that she had entered. At 42, she was a successful jazz singer in New Orleans, her voice a smoky blend of heartache and soul that drew crowds to packed nightclubs at night. Her name was on posters, her face lit up stages, and her charisma held everyone spellbound. But even as she smiled and laughed, there was a secret beneath the surface that no one knew. Not her, not her bandmates, not her fans, not even her closest friends. Marie had always lived fast. Late nights, brief romances, and a carefree attitude had shaped her 20s and 30s. She never thought much about the risks. In her mind, she was untouchable. "I'm too stubborn to slow down," she joked, drinking a whiskey after her set. It started with headaches, nagging, persistent, and unlike anything she'd experienced before. At first, Marie ignored them, brushing them off as a result of stress in the heat of Louisiana summer. But as the weeks turned into months, the pain became harder to dismiss. Her hands began trembling when she played the piano, and she stumbled over lyrics that she had sung for years. Her friends noticed the changes in her behavior. Once sharp-witted and eloquent, Marie began forgetting conversations and losing her temper over trivial things. "You're not yourself," her best friend, Lena, told her one evening after a show. Marie snapped back defensively. "Maybe I'm just tired. You ever think of that?" Then came the hallucinations. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and whispers echoed in her mind, growing louder when she was alone. She dismissed it as exhaustion, but deep down she knew something was wrong. When she finally saw a doctor, she downplayed her symptoms, reluctant to admit how bad things had gotten. But during the examination, the doctor noticed the scars on her skin, faint marks that she hadn't even thought about. He asked her for her history, about past relationships, and about things that she didn't want to talk about. Marie grew defensive, but the doctor remained calm. "Let's run some tests," he said. The results confirmed it. Marie had syphilis. Not the early stages where the antibiotics could have stopped it in its tracks, but tertiary syphilitis, an advanced stage where the bacteria had invaded her nervous system, causing irreversible damage. Marie was stunned. The doctor explained untreated syphilis doesn't just go away. It probably hid in the body, quietly spreading until it destroyed everything in its path. The damage was already severe. The bacteria had attacked her brain, leading to neurosyphilis, which explained the headaches, memory loss, and hallucinations. Her coordination problems were due to nerve damage, and her weakened heart showed signs of further complications. Marie began treatment immediately, but the effects were limited. The antibiotics stopped the bacteria from spreading further, but they couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. She struggled to perform, her once powerful voice now trembling with weakness. In her final performance, Marie sang a haunting rendition of Summertime, her voice carrying a weight of sorrow that left the audience in tears. And it was the last time she stood on stage. The woman who had once lit up New Orleans faded into obscurity, her mind and body ravaged by a disease that she thought she would never face. That's it for this episode of Serial Stories. Hope you guys liked it. We will do an actual story on Friday. See you guys then. Like, comment, subscribe. It all helps. Especially if you stuck around for the whole thing. We're 20 some odd minutes. You guys are awesome. Thank you. Bye.